Right, good afternoon. Is that amplifying? I can't. Yes, you can hear me. Good. Right. Welcome back to Wednesday. Just to reiterate, because this is confusing me, so I'm sure it's confusing some of you. This module's occasionally Thursday, occasionally Wednesday and Thursday. So tomorrow afternoon there will be another lecture from this module. Not from me, I should add. Should liven things up a bit. Right, so, just before I get on with the content of this week, just a couple of housekeeping things from last week to pass on to you. Let's get Moodle up. Oh, while that's failing to load, one thing to say, the multiple choice questions. For this first topic, they will be based on they will be based on a paper that I'm going to point you towards during this lecture. They will go up on Moodle tomorrow afternoon. So you'll be able to, and there'll only be 5 of them. So it's nice and straightforward. It's a very short paper to read and questions to answer. So having said that, let's get into. As a matter of interest, just while that's loading, a brief show of hands. For those of you who were here last semester, Moodle better than UEL Plus? Worse than UEL Plus? Yes. That's interesting. Right, my next question, which I won't do like that because it's going to cause chaos, is to ask why, but I will post the thing on Moodle and you can tell me why. So. Right, so, onwards. That's not loaded properly. Right, having got there eventually, hopefully you will have noticed that the video recording of the lecture from last week has appeared on the top of presentation the and the best essay. Etc. Case is that's 1960. We just discovered that I sound like an extra from EastEnders on a video. And Rachel Mulvey sounds unbelievably posh for a northerner. Down the bottom, you'll also find audio recordings as well. I would apologise, the start of the audio, the start of the first audio recording, the sound is particularly poor as I was wearing the microphone and Rachel wasn't. But the actual content of the module is all there, so you just need to fast forward a bit through it. So, having said all that, back to today. So, what I'm going to do today is to have a look at, carrying on from where we left off last week, and to have a look at a potential individual differences approach to the idea of evil. We'll then look at actually how well these various theories we've got actually fit with the evidence. And finally, I'll move on to having a look at actually thinking about how you'd attack an essay question based on this topic, and also just to point you towards the fact that there's going to be different sorts of essay and different sorts of content deciding on which topic you decide to address. So, onwards from where we were last week. We got to going through Milgram and Zimbardo, and there's a couple of things which, if you go and read an A-level psychology textbook, it will tell you that we learn from Milgram's work and Zimbardo's work. Firstly, from Milgram. The drive to obey figures of authority, that we're naturally disposed to obey authority figures, whatever they happen to be telling us, which I think we agreed last week is actually a fairly painful thing to accept, because we all still think, actually, no, we wouldn't be the person pressing the button all the way up to XXX may kill you. But actually, all the data suggests that we probably would. And the other thing, and the big thing from the Stanford prison experiment, is what Zimbardo calls the power of the situation. That actually, it's the situation that you put someone in that makes them behave in a particular way, rather than something internal to them. It's the external environment, it's the environment that they're in that makes them behave in any particular way. And that's the overridingly important conclusion from the Stanford prison experiment. Now, if we take those two things, actually, let me show you the paper. I've put up on Moodle, where is it? Zimbardo paper on evil, aimed at undergraduates. Yeah. And eventually it will load, there we are. This is a fairly brief paper that Phil Zimbardo wrote in 2001, looking at the Stanford prison experiment and what you can conclude from it. And it was aimed at the American Psychology Honours Society undergraduate students. So it's aimed at you as a market. But he covers in this not only the basic details of the experiment itself, but also the conclusions that he drew from it. And I mentioned this on Moodle, but it's something which I think is worth thinking about, especially when it comes to later lectures that we've got in this module, where we've got a lecture on conspiracy theories and we have a lecture on terrorism. That this article was written before September the 11th, 2001. Before the Americans' attitude to such things changed dramatically. So this is not written with the foreknowledge of Al-Qaeda, of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, of Abu Ghraib and the rest of it. This was written before that, and I think it's important to remember that. Those of you who were here last semester will remember me banging on about thinking about the context of work. So, back to the slides. So, things, in addition to the power of the situation, things that Zimbardo talks about as you could draw from the prison experiment. Well, firstly, something that he called de-individualization, which is a horrible psychology word. It's the idea of taking away somebody's sense of uniqueness, of them being an individual. Because actually, if you see yourself as an individual, you're more likely to be spontaneous, to be rebellious, to be independent. If your individuality is taken away, you're much less likely to rebel. And if you look at what he did, and you think back to the videos last week, he gave all the guards uniforms. He gave them mirrored sunglasses and sticks. They all looked the same. And interestingly, if you look at some of the other examples for last week, I mean, Nazi Germany is the great example of this. Huge varieties of different groups with different uniforms. All very elaborate uniforms, shiny buttons and insignias, but all de-individualizing people. They're not, they become part of a group rather than an individual who's going to stand up and do something on their own. And I don't know, you'll find if you look at very traditional social psychology, I don't know if you may have done some of this last semester, but there's a very well-known social psychology phenomena called diffusion of responsibility. That the bigger a group you're in, the less likely you are to act about something. If you're walking down a street and you see somebody collapsed on the floor, there's actually more chance of you going to help if you're on your own than you are if you're in a big group. because you're already thinking actually somebody else will go and do it. And that comes out, you can see that going on here. The other thing, which I think is really dramatic, if you compare the photos of the Stanford Prison Experiment and what went on in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq during the Iraq War, and I'm going to show you a bit later on a video about Abu Ghraib to sort of cement some of this stuff, is quite how similar it is. And this is the idea of de-individualising people and how you might... Oh, actually, before I do that, first question. Why the sunglasses? Why did he give them mirrored sunglasses? Eye contact, yeah, exactly. It is amazing that we draw so much from looking people in the eye. And that's it's a very primal sort of individual thing. Slightly off the subject, but I used to do a lecture based on this years and years ago. At the very point that I said, why the mirrored sunglasses, a student walked in late behind me wearing mirrored sunglasses. Funniest lecture I've ever seen. So, parallels between the Stanford Prison Experiment and Abu Ghraib, and showing this de-individualisation thing. Abu Ghraib, Stanford Prison Experiment. Why the things on the head? The de-individualisation thing. They're not people anymore, and that comes on to the next point. And I made the point last week, but these photos from Abu Ghraib, which appeared in 2004, the photos you will have seen, and certainly the photos that appeared on the news media, are by far the mildest of them. There are some particularly hideous ones. Phil Zimbardo, who we talked about a lot last week, was an expert witness for the defence in the court-martial of some of the soldiers involved in this, and so had access to all the material. And when he came to do a talk here when he launched his book on the subject, and some of the photos you really don't want to see, and they're going to give you nightmares. Hideous stuff. So, very similar things. The other thing he came up with, and it runs in parallel with this idea of de-individualisation, is... Oh, actually, before I go on there, I should make a point about that. That's weirdly, this idea of not being able to see someone's face and what you would do to them, that's been tested experimentally. Think about the setup of the Stanford Prison Experiment and giving people electric shocks. Weirdly, if you put a paper bag on the head of the person you're giving the electric shock, you're more likely to give them more of an electric shock, which is a particularly weird thought, but you can experimentally demonstrate these things as well. So, the other thing he talks about, depersonalisation. Whatever the group it is that you're persecuting, actually making them in some way look and feel less human. And it's intriguing that one of the first things the guards in the Stanford Prison Experiment did was take away their clothes, give them all the same thing to wear, this weird sort of frock thing, put like a hairnet on them, and give them each numbers rather than names. Sorry, question. This one here, this was taken at the beginning. Do you remember what Eve said in the film that one of the people started to rebel at the very beginning of the song? That's the guy who rebelled. So calling them by number, not name, and obviously very obvious parallel with the Second World War. And something which struck me when I was talking to a colleague about doing this lecture, a colleague who lives in the country and keeps animals. If you keep animals and you're going to eat them, do you give them names? Okay, why psychologically would that make one hell of a difference if they've got a name? Yes, exactly. So something, again, very basic, that the idea of something having a name makes it more personal to you. You're less likely to want to injure it. Exactly the thing going on here. We take away their names, we give them numbers, we take away their identity altogether, we make them all look identical. They've all had their heads shaved. Sadly, that wasn't just to make them all look identical, that was also because the Germans had uses for their hair. But stuffing cushions? So again, this idea of depersonalisation is there. I will show you, if I've got time at the end of this, a video which I think beautifully summarises this depersonalisation idea, but is hideous. In the, and you'll find talk about this in the Zimbardo paper I've put up. This process of certainly when you're looking at mass acts of evil requires an element of preparation to get people to do it. You can't just tell people, go and kill that 5 million people. It all needs to be set up. And so you need propaganda setting up that these people are depersonalised. They're not like us. So it's all right for us to do this to them. And there is horrendous propaganda videos from Germany in the 1930s of saying, we have, sorry, hello, can you go in the back door? That's completely thrown. Yes. Propaganda videos of saying we have to do something about this Jewish problem. But the voiceover is saying we have to do something about this Jewish problem. The film is of a plague of rats running around. And I'll dig it out and show you, but it's horrific. So, we've got these two ideas. De-individualisation and depersonalisation. Actually, by doing these things, it makes acts of potential evil more likely. I've already said that Zimbardo had tried testing this idea by actually literally doing a very similar experiment to the Stanford Prison experiment. You're giving somebody fake electric shocks. You're much more likely to go higher on the scale of electric shocks if that person has got a paper bag over their head than if they haven't. That's a very, very curious idea if you think about it, and quite horrible. But there's an even better experimental test of this from Albert Bandura. Now, you'll have probably come across, certainly those of you who've done A-level psychology, will have come across Albert Bandura, a hugely well-known, enormous name in the sort of establishment of psychology. He's famous for what's known as the Bobo doll study, which demonstrated that showing children violence on TV makes them more violent, allegedly. And very lovely experimental design, that one. But this is a really straightforward study that he did in the mid-70s, but gives you a really simple feel of how this might work. Similar setup to all these other ones. It's a learning study in which you're going to teach participants something, and they're going to get an electric shock if they get something wrong. The setup is his participants are students from his university. He tells his participants that the people they're going to be teaching are students from another university who haven't arrived yet. And could you just wait in the waiting room until they arrive? Their bus hasn't arrived. So, all his participants from his university are sitting in the waiting room. As they're sitting there, a research assistant comes in and says one of three things. They either say, the subjects from the other school are here. They say, the subjects from the other school are here, they seem nice. Or they say, the subject from the other school are here, they seem like animals. At no point after this do the participants see or hear anything of these other people. They're sitting in one room pressing buttons. They think they're giving somebody else an electric shock. What happens is, if you happen to be in the group that heard they seem like animals, you gave them more of an electric shock than you did if you were in either of the other two groups. And obviously, Oh God, I've gone backwards. If you were in this group, you didn't give them as many at all. That one in the middle, and that one you gave them the most. So even that very simple manipulation can make you injure someone potentially, which again, a fairly hideous thought. So, which leads me to a question. So we've covered Milgram, Zimbardo, these ideas of depersonalisation, de-individualisation. Does that make any sense with the evidence that we've got? Well, if we think about Milgram's experiment for a moment. So, very briefly, Milgram bungs his advert in the local newspaper. We're going to pay $4 an hour, come to the university, we're going to do this experiment. You're sitting in a room with the experimenter, the learner's in the other room, you're giving them an electric shock, blah, 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 blah. The teacher and learner are in separate rooms. So, does any of this data fit with this idea of de-individualisation or depersonalisation? Well, it's a bit of some and some going on. Eventually, Milgram ran loads of versions of his experiment. It weren't, that layout is the classic one, but there were many others. So things like, if you don't have it in a university, you just have it in an office somewhere, the number of people going all the way drops down a bit, still doing it. So there's some influence going on there of it being a posh university. It's an ordinary person in charge. It's not somebody in a white coat. That drops off a lot as well. The experimenter not there with you, so the person in the white coat's not there with you. Still 20% of people are prepared to kill whoever's in the other room, but drops off a lot. But victim in the same room as the participant. It's dropped off a bit. I mean, that's gone down, what, 30%? So it does make a difference. If you've got some visual contact with the person, you can see them, you're less likely to injure them. Interestingly, participant required to touch the victim drops off another 10%. So actually seems to be in physical contact makes a difference. So there's some element there that's right. But actually, the other half of it, where's the putting the paper bag over the head and, you know, de-individualising them and all that? Because actually it was just, the guy there just looked exactly the same, looked like somebody off the street. You hadn't done anything to them. So sort of some and some explanation goes on there. It fits a bit in some ways and doesn't in other ways. So already, hopefully, you sort of get a bit of a feel of that it might not fit completely. So really, is there any dehumanisation going on there? Sorry, question. Yeah, that one. Yep. Yeah, that's weird. That actually, it seems that it's the obeying authority that is the more important thing actually than them being in the room. The authority figure's gone, less likely to hurt someone. So it does seem that actually obeying authority here is causing the biggest drop. That makes sense. Yeah. Now, is there any dehumanisation going on in that experiment? You know, are we calling the person who's getting the electric shock just by a number? Are we shaving their head or doing anything like that? We don't seem to be. We're dressing them in some demeaning manner. So that bit of it's not really there. Now, I think at which point I'm going to show you a little bit of. I'll show you the first half of a video I want to show you about Abu Ghraib, because I think it's a really nice way of cementing the sort of theoretical stuff here into the real world. But before I go through this, I wanted to make a couple of points about this this lecture and a couple of the other lectures here. And I'll come back to this point at the end. But one of the things that is very difficult about this stuff is that it's quite painful to think about. And we don't like to think that we would behave like that. And it can provoke some very, very extreme views. I mean, I'll show you this video now, and it would be perfectly possible at the end of this video to come away with the view that all Americans are raving lunatics. However, I would point out to you when your brain gets to that conclusion, which at one point during this video there's at least one person you will want to lynch, I would point out to you that this video was produced by an American cable TV company, HBO, who make The Sopranos and the like. The Wire, yes, thank you. So actually, things like, well, all Americans are obviously lunatics, doesn't really help very much here. Equally, you know, and the same goes for the opposite. When we come to me doing conspiracy theories, Lara coming to do terrorism, you know, saying, you know, anyone with a beard is obviously a terrorist is equally a stupid statement. So do think about your own reactions to these things and think about how does that fit with actually what we've been talking about. So, well, that's a bad sign, tripping over invisible things, isn't it? Oh, actually, I'll tell you what, before I play this bit of video, let's just make, oh, bloody hell. I was going to do this, but there's a lot. So, yeah. Yes, yeah, the paper I showed you, and I'll come back to that at the end. I will just run through these. Liking the new glasses. Yes, the reason I'm wearing these glasses is I put my other glasses down at home and couldn't find them this morning. Which was quite fun because it turns out that if you can't find your glasses, it's quite hard to find your other glasses. If you think about the logic of that one. And I'm also going to have to do this because these aren't very focal. Please can you put the module handbook into a format that I can download it on my iPhone like it was last semester? Actually, that's a very useful point, which I'll talk about now. The whole Moodle thing. We are in the process of trying to get all of this into formats that will work on anything. If you come across anything that doesn't work in any particular device you're trying to use it on, can you let me know? I'm particularly interested, and this is going to sound weird coming from me, in Android phones, because I don't have one, so I can't test it. But yes is the answer to that question. I will sort that out. You always tell us not to leave essays for the last day and to start at least a week earlier, but one assessment is a timed essay. How do you expect us to get good grades writing an essay in 1 or 2 hours? Actually, that's a good point, which I will address. 2 points about that. The point about you getting a degree is us testing you in a lot of different ways. The very good point about exams and writing essays in exams is we know you wrote it. That information's come straight out of your head onto the paper. If you're doing coursework, you've got books all around you. Exam essays and coursework essays are a completely and utterly different skill. They happen to both be called essays. The way we mark an exam essay is completely different from the way we would mark a coursework essay. And lots more about that, and I've just pressed buttons, so I don't know what I've done. Right. We'll have a session towards the end where I'll actually go through about essay writing. I have an Android phone, and although it's not your module, I cannot open the lecture slides on PY1104. That's bound to be a question for John Turner, and somebody take a picture of his face when you say Android phone, and he just stares at you thinking it's a robot of some sort. Can you put all the slides on Moodle in PowerPoint format too, please? I hoped I had. If I hadn't, I will get on to that. Do we get a reading week? No, you get 2 weeks off for Easter. It's on the list. They had paper bags over their heads because they were feeling sick, if only. Do we get a reading week this month? Blimey, we've only just started. No, it's something like the 22nd of March it starts. I think that's right, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, actually, no, I do know the answer to that, because there's the Thursday, the 21st of March, which I am teaching. Then it's my birthday the next day, then it's Easter. So that's that done. Next. Would it ever be possible to make an app one day for the Moodle stuff on App Store? This is going to sound madly prophetic, but I was actually at a meeting this morning with corporate marketing who are redesigning UEL's website so that it will work on phones and tablets, and it will do things like if you turn your phone that way, it will reformat the website so it fits on the screen properly. However, their answer to that very question was, if the things are designed properly as a website, an app is unnecessary. So the hope is that actually what will happen is, as Moodle is developed, you won't actually see any difference with what an app would be. Inbox. Is there a little bit of dehumanisation in Milgram because the participant does not see the person? Is shocking to answer, and there's a light flash. Yeah, I mean, the fact that their person's in the other room, is that depersonalisation, de-individualisation? There's something there, but it's relatively minor. I have an Android Sony tablet, and I'm not make to open any of your files. Well, that's. My Apple user is also slightly biased that the spell checking's obviously not very good on it. That's interesting, actually. If whoever that is, if you've got an Android thing, if you can actually send me an email and tell me exactly what it is you're getting and what it says on the screen when you try to open them, I will do my best to get that fixed. Oh, good. Can I summarise dehumanisation and depersonalisation can be linked to mob mentality where you are on your own? Blood, this is a long one. Is there a great yourself follow all the person who sent me the very long one, the last one, yes, is the answer to that. Although man is dumb and men are stupid at the end. Sadly enough, it's women as well. So. Question. Yeah. Oh, I will come back to a lot more about essays in the exam, but very briefly, there's no, in terms of how much you write in the exam, there's no real sort of, we expect you to write X amount. I mean, I'll show you the exam booklets, but they're like A4 pages. Sort of, once you've filled up 2 sides of one of those books, nobody's going to go, well, they've not written enough. Equally, I've seen people write 10 sides of one of those books, and after about 3 sides, I'm thinking, I wish this person had stopped. So, you know, banging on can be just as bad as not writing enough. So, anyway, onwards with the video. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show this in 2 halves. So, I'll show a bit of this, we'll have a break, I'll do a bit more talking, then we'll show a bit more of it. And I will press play. And sound will come out.
Strap down your arms to avoid any excessive movement on your part during the experiment. Is that too tight? This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Now get a shock of 75 volts. He kind of did some yelling in there. 75 volts, Jim. Please continue. This will be at 3:30. Just how far can you go in this thing? As far as is necessary.
I can't stand the pain. Help me out of
You can't stand painful, but not dangerous.
They're hollering, he can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
285 volts.
Continue, please.
That place turned me into a monster. I was very angry. You know, just being Abu Ghraib, you know, it would change your whole mind frame. You know, you can go from being a docile, jolly guy, and you go to Abu Ghraib for a few, you know, just being in Iraq for a while, you know, you become, a robot.
It was a door that I was afraid to walk through. You know, if you walk through it, at which point do you say it's enough? You know, what's cruel enough? How do you go back from that? And I was afraid that I just wouldn't come back, that I would just get lost.
Something in your brain clicks that everything you see is normal. I mean, you'll go crazy if you don't adapt to what you're seeing. You gotta block it out. You gotta do something to make your day go by without going crazy.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world. And we stand together to win the war against terrorism.
I was in Algebra 2 class, and it was just a regular day. We were sitting down waiting for class, and then there was an announcement. It was brought into real retrospect when my friend Chris, he leaned over and he's like, "Hey, aren't you in the reserves?" I thought, yes I am in the reserves. How is this going to affect me?
The ultimate reason I joined was to be a part of the effort to make the country a safer place. I wanted to help protect our country so that people that wanted to come in and attack us wouldn't have that opportunity again.
It made me feel like we have to do something. It made me feel like, someone has to pay. It's like we can't let 2 buildings get blown up and not do anything about it.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
And we will do whatever it takes to smoke them out and get them running, and we'll get them.
The Geneva Convention's question doesn't really come up until the war in Afghanistan starts, and people start to come into the custody of our forces there. And so the Defense Department wants to know, what is the status of the people we're catching, the Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters?
The 4 current Geneva Conventions were
standards against which all nations and all combating forces will be judged. They're binding international law, and they represent a humanitarian and human rights standard for the world. They're important because U.S. military has been frequently engaged in combat. American forces are always at risk of being captured, and the Geneva Conventions protect American soldiers from ill treatment in the event of capture.
After the American Civil War and up until the Second World War, the United States was consistently known for observing standards that were in fact higher than the Geneva Convention standards, and consistently advocating that all countries should operate to a level above the Geneva Convention standards.
At the Justice Department, we did not think that Geneva Conventions applied in the war against Al-Qaeda because they did not sign the Geneva Conventions and they don't follow any of the rules of warfare. Al-Qaeda, if you look at what happened on 9/11, has no interest in following any of those rules. They deliberately kill civilians, they deliberately target civilians, they disguise themselves as civilians. They don't take prisoners, as far as we can tell. Instead, they try to kidnap people and execute them on the web or on television.
Officials in the White House, and particularly in the Department of Justice, said Geneva Convention shouldn't hold sway, and that point of view finally triumphed. The President made the decision early in 2002 that Geneva Conventions would not hold, and this was unprecedented in American history. Never happened.
The war is a terrible thing, and it's always right on the edge of falling apart. Of awful things happening. And the only way, sort of ironically, the only way to conduct a war in a civilized manner is to ensure that everybody understands what the rules are to the maximum extent possible. And when you start messing around with those rules, when you say they don't apply, they're all terrorists, so different rules apply, now you're in unlimited warfare.
Handled not as prisoners of wars, because they're not, but as unlawful combatants. As I understand it, technically, unlawful combatants do not have any rights under the Geneva Convention.
This war was a war that was going to depend first and foremost on intelligence, that is, on information derived from prisoners of war. Therefore, rules regarding interrogation, what you could and couldn't do to prisoners, were absolutely central to fighting this new war. The Department of Justice built a theory that essentially would render moot, render powerless, the various undertakings that the United States had signed on to that prohibited torture. The most obvious one is the Convention Against Torture.
The statute does not define many of the terms that it uses. It doesn't say what severe means, for example. It doesn't really contain any definition of physical pain or suffering. So our job was try to figure out what did that statute actually mean, because the words are ambiguous, vague, and had not been interpreted before. Our office eventually issued a memo in August of 2002 to the White House. Physical pain amounting to torture must be equivalent in intensity to the pain accompanying serious physical injury, such as organ failure, impairment of bodily function, or even death.
The heart of this argument is to redefine torture so it is so narrowly conceived, it essentially allows very, very severe interrogation that cannot be construed to be torture.
What this memo articulates is the view that torture is prohibited, but torture is defined very, very narrowly to consist almost of imminent death or loss of bodily organ or function. A definition of torture that was later criticized by another observer as the kind of definition that probably would have justified most of what Saddam Hussein was doing in his prisons as not being torture.
I can remember sitting in my office and I'm reading some of these memos. It was stunning. It literally took my breath away. I couldn't believe that I was reading this and that it hadn't been shredded and burned and buried as the wild imaginations of some lowly lawyer in the bowels of justice that should never see the light of day. But now suddenly it's become U.S. policy.
Pause.
Why do you want?
That's a bit of that, and we'll come back to a bit more of that. But just before we have a break, as a matter of interest already, I showed you last week the photographs from Abu Ghraib of the soldiers, some of whom were talking there, torturing, as we've seen there, the prisoners. Very easy last week, having seen those photographs, to come to the conclusion that those soldiers were doing something evil. Now, given the choice now, having seen just half of that, if we go for, were the evil people the soldiers in that, or the blokes in suits? The suits? Yeah. We're already starting to see quite how complex this idea is. What this comes on to in the second half of this is to talk about the situation in Abu Ghraib itself, and how actually what Zimbardo talked about, the power of the situation, makes such a difference to how people behave. But already, hopefully, you're seeing by that suddenly your interpretation of it switches, and suddenly it seems like the evil people are not the fairly simple, for want of a better word, soldiers involved there. It's the people who were directing them. The scary guy who's the Geneva Convention thing, which essentially I think he said, they don't fight by the rules, so we're not going to either. Which sounded a bit like two wrongs don't make a right, but who knows. Anyway, at that point, let's have a swift break. If you can be back by, actually, right, welcome back. Hello? Hello? Yes? Is this working? Yes, good, in which case listen to me. Before we carry on, I'll just quickly run through these. Can we change Moodle back to UEL Plus? No. No, honestly, the student feedback for years has been the fact that every 2 weeks UEL Plus fell over and wouldn't work properly. This doesn't, or shouldn't, I should say. Is there an app for Pix One Word? Is there an app for Pix One? No, that's past me, boy. Cancel. Will the marking be harsher next year or still at this level? No. The further you go, the more we expect of you. I have an Android Samsung Galaxy Note. Congratulations. Is that the ridiculously large one? Don't you look a bit of a plum with it to your ear? Right. Will you be my Valentine? Another one. I have an Android Galaxy Note. Just saying. Somebody's very proud. Is it also depersonalisation in Milgram to the two people being given the names of the learner, etc., and not their own name? Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of this going on, but it's very low level, I think, in the Milgram experiment, the whole depersonalisation stuff, in comparison with what you see in the real world. Does school not partake in de-individualisation via uniform? Of course they do. Why would schools want... Why would schools want pupils to be in uniform? If I go back to that phrase I read out on that slide, hold on. Because if you're in uniform, you are... Where's it gone? It's in here somewhere. Taking away people's sense of uniqueness and individuality, because this encourages spontaneity, rebelliousness, and independence. Exactly what you don't want in a classroom full of kids. Yes, that's the point of uniforms. The Geneva Conventions are meant to be absolute international law, but that clip shows how easily the US can find a loophole and have minimal repercussions. Yeah, that's sort of the point I was making. So yeah, thank you. So, sorry, not just the US, but any nation, any P5 nation, not the US, any nation can get round laws. That's, and interestingly, of course, if you look at, on that subject of this being done by countries and laws, of course, Nazi Germany, Hitler was elected to be Chancellor of Germany. He didn't take over, it wasn't a military coup, he was voted in. Hey there, which and where are the 7 studies we can take part in? You can take part in any study, it doesn't have to be 7, just you have to take part in 7. We will bring ones here. Anna's going to get you to take part in some stuff tomorrow. I showed you that one last week. If you go into the help desk, you will find notice boards with hundreds of the things on. Desperate third-year students. I miss you, smiley face. Just FYI, Samsung Galaxy Tab has better specs than the iPad 2 with expandable memory. Do they? Oh, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for whoever sent me this one as a precursor and an invitation to my conspiracy theories lecture. Do they have proof that 9/11 was a terrorist attack? See my lecture coming up in a few weeks' time. What is your opinion on evil, torture, etc.? Somebody asked me that via email in the week. My answer to that is, and my apologies for those of you who weren't here last year, but see all of my lectures last semester. What matters is not what my opinion is. What matters is what does the evidence say. That's the important thing. We're a science. No, and also the place for opinions is in the pub. Right. Next, back to where we were. What I'm going to do is talk a bit more and then show you the other half of that video. So, onwards, where were we? So, that was all talking about Milgram and Zimbardo. There is, however, another potential approach to this question, which takes a completely different avenue. And I will say now that I am going to very deliberately be fairly light touch approach here, because actually towards the end of this module you're going to get another topic focusing very specifically on mental health stuff, which will give you a much broader picture of mental health approaches. And so I'm going to give you sort of a taster here. But this is Simon Baron-Cohen, as we established last week, Ali G's uncle. Much to his eternal disgust. Simon Baron-Cohen is the Cambridge Professor of Developmental Psychopathology. He's best known for his work on theory of mind in autism, and has done some absolutely fascinating work with autism. But over the last, well, actually, this started off as part of his work in autism about 7 or 8 years ago now. He produced a book where he was looking at the idea of why was it that autism is a predominantly male trait. And it is, it's enormous. It's something like 8-to-1, male to female autism. And that suggests that there's something very specific about males and autism. So he looked and he ended up with, and this is hugely oversimplification, but you'll get the point, is he ended up with coming up with 2 measures that are used to try and determine propensity to autism. One thing which he called systematizing, and this was, if you like, the desire to know how things work, the desire to take things apart and put them back together again, to fiddle with things, to see how it works, to take the back off computers and see what's going on inside. And he found that that particular trait of wanting to know how things work and understand the mechanics of things is predominantly male, hugely male. Very rare to come across females with that trait. You still do, obviously, because all of these things are some sort of normal distribution, but actually much more likely to be male than female on this systemizing trait that he came up with. The other side of that coin is something that he called empathizing. Now, this is a very different idea. This is the idea of being able to read emotions in others. And this will not come as a surprise to probably, looking at this, 80% of you, but males aren't necessarily that good at that. For all of us, you have probably had this experience, but I know I've had. I'll have been out with my other half and another couple. We'll get in the car on the way home, and my other half will say to me, "Well, she wasn't happy, was she?" And I go, "Sorry, what?" And the whole conversation will ensue about, "How did you not notice that? She's obviously upset about something." And I'm, "Sorry, what?" And it's a fairly well recognised male, female trait. This ability to be able to see and read emotions in other people. And what Baron Cohen found was actually these two scales, the systematising scale, the wanting to take things apart and fiddle with them and understand how they worked, and the empathising scale. If you took these two things together, they're actually quite good predictors of autism. And it sort of makes sense that actually if you think about, if you know anybody on the autistic spectrum, actually that systematising, wanting to understand and know how things work, is a trait you see in autistic kids quite a lot. And equally, the empathising thing is exactly the theory of mind that Baron Cohen started off with. The idea that actually the difficulty kids with autism have is that they can't see what other people are thinking. They can't empathise with them. So his thinking started off in that direction, and he wrote a book called The Essential Difference 7 or 8 years ago now about these two scales and how this was interesting in looking at autism. But people picked up these scales because they were quite interesting and quite easy to administer. And I don't have a copy with me, but I can describe it. The empathising one is actually, the tests of empathising is actually really interesting, because what he did was to ask people to display particular emotions in their face. So whether you were smiling or sad or angry. He then took pictures of them and just cut the eyes out of the picture. So he then presented participants with a set of pictures of 4 different eyes, pairs of eyes. And he would say to participants, which one of these sets of eyes is smiling? And what you find is that if you give that to male participants, they go, "What the hell are you on about? There are 4 sets of eyes. How the hell would I know? Because I can't see their mouths." Female participants look at it and are quite good at it. And so it's that even just given eyes, females can actually read emotions in those much better than males can. I should say, for the males amongst you, this is slightly odd and slightly skewed by the fact that, by definition almost, if you are a male in a psychology class, you are much likely to have a female-style brain. We have good experimental evidence of that. So it's, yes, congratulations for those of you who are looking slightly panicked by that one. Years and years ago here, we did a study where we took males in female professions and females in male professions. What you find is people behave much more like their profession than their gender. If you're a male in a female-dominated profession, you will react much more like a female would. If you're a female in a male-dominated profession, you would react much more like a male would. And actually, if you think about that, it is not the world's most surprising conclusion. And if you've met any of the male half of the psychology staff here, you'd also realise it's not that surprising. So, onwards. This idea, we move on. So we've talked about autism. Now, the idea of empathy that he was talking about, the other half from systematising. My apologies for a small bit of PowerPoint karaoke, but our ability to identify what someone else is thinking or feeling, and to respond to their thoughts and feelings with an appropriate emotion. So we can not only can we identify their feelings, but we can respond to it with the appropriate emotion. So it's not just recognising it, it's coming up with the appropriate response to it as well. And I think that's quite important as we move on to where this is going. So empathy is not just being able to read the emotion, it's being able to come up with the right response to it. So the way, just as a matter of interest, the way he goes about measuring emotion, it's a very simple 40-item questionnaire. Things like, I really enjoy caring for other people. I try and solve my own problems rather than discussing them with others. People often tell me that I went too far in driving my point home in a discussion. There's 40 of those. If you put them together, you end up with somebody's score on this empathy scale. Now, Baron Cohen works at, if I go back for a moment, you'll see he's a professor of developmental psychopathology, and he works in Cambridge and has got access to all sorts of populations. These two questionnaires, the systematising and particularly the empathising one, got used a lot around a lot of populations. And you already start to see, if you read that definition of empathy, being able to see emotions in others and respond with the appropriate emotion, you can see that actually it starts to fit with the sort of evil behaviour we've been talking about. And Baron Cohen's gone on to sort of try and break up this empathy scale a bit and has come up with 6 different levels of empathy. I say 6 because he started off at level 0, which is why he didn't start off at level 1, is anybody's guess. So we go from absolutely no empathy at all. So cannot read emotions in others and cannot respond with an appropriate emotion. My typing is getting worse. Capable of hurtling others, but can show regret. So there, it seems like almost that's someone who isn't reading the emotion in another person, but if they cause some sort of injury, can recognise that they've done it. One step up from that, clearly problems with empathy, but there is some sign that they understand how other people feel. Level 3, people who know that they have a problem with empathy and they thus avoid situations that would require empathy. People who are never in long-term relationships might well fall into that bracket. Level 4, lower than average on empathy. Prefer the practical to the emotional. More men than women. We get into here, if you like, a terrible word, the normal phrase. So, level 4, let's for simplicity's sake call that men. Level 5, more women than men. Marginally above average on empathy and friendships based on emotional intimacy, shared confidences, as opposed to football. So, I should say there is one other bit which he does make the point that there are some people who are hugely, hugely high on empathy and may be in very high up or very successful in the caring professions, but very unusual individuals. Now, this scale, this idea, led Baron Cohen to think about, when we get down to this 0 levels of empathy, that some of this is going to be people who are autistic. However, there are other issues at play here, and you start to then get into the area of evil behaviour. Because what he suggests, I don't know if I can, let me find the page in here. If I can find it. There it is. Come on. Ah, there it is, right. Doc cam. Switch on and put it under there. Yes, finally. No? Oh, why am I seeing it and you're not? That's a bit odd. Ah, right, finally. So, what he suggested is that you end up with 3 different sorts of people who fall into having this 0 level of empathy and it having a negative effect. In addition to the people who are autistic, you get 3 groups of people. Those with borderline personality disorder issues. Those who are narcissists. Interestingly, I won't go into it here, but there is some fascinating research that says that some very successful business people fall into this 0 degrees of empathy narcissist category. And for those of you, back to my Apple analogies again, for those of you who've read Steve Jobs' biography, he obviously had some sort of personality issue because he was a deeply unpleasant person to work for, but hugely successful. And there is some work suggesting that actually a lot of very successful business people may fall into this category. But the third one, and the one which I think is of most interest to us, go upwards, psychopaths. And if you give, fortunately, the likes of Simon Baron-Cohen, who's got access to secure hospitals, you can go into a secure hospital, you can give people who've been diagnosed with all sorts of psychopathology this questionnaire measuring empathy. You find very low levels of empathy. People who've killed people and can see nothing wrong with it. He talks in his book about interviewing a guy in a secure hospital who'd had been in a bar one night and had been having a drink, had looked up, and a bloke sitting across from him in the bar had apparently looked at him in a slightly aggressive manner. At which point this guy had broken the top off the bottle, walked over and shoved it in this guy's neck and killed him. When he was questioned about, and when Simon Baron-Cohen talks to him about it, he said, well, he was disrespecting me by looking at me. And he asked him, did you do anything wrong? Well, no, I didn't. I have to stand up for this. It would be terrible if people were disrespecting me. So even to this day, having gone through the system, still can't see that he did anything wrong. Now, if you follow through all of that, I'm not going to label, I very deliberately haven't laboured the details of that because it's the principle of the idea of that I want you to get, that this is a very different approach from what Zimbardo and Milgram are talking about. This is suggesting that there might be something very specific to some individuals that make them behave in an evil manner. Now, you can also, if you brain scan, sort of wonderful study, if you brain scan a selection of psychopaths, you do find specific brain issues, specific areas of the brain not functioning as they do with everybody else. And interestingly, I did actually, go back to there, come across, is that going to work? Possibly. Well, there's an interesting question. Is that going to load? I'll talk about it anyway. There's a neuroscientist in Germany who has been doing brain scans on people who are in German prisons, the German prison system, and have been diagnosed with various sorts of psychopathology. And he's finding, the reason I put this up is because I actually read this was last week, the 5th of February. He's finding actually that particular parts of the brain are not functioning in the same manner as they do in normal individuals. Now, there's an interesting question there, which isn't isn't part of well, certainly won't be part of the exam for this essay, but it's worth thinking about because I think it coincides with sort of biopsychology stuff, which is actually there's two potential questions there, isn't there? We've got a group of people with low empathy. Go back to there. We can do brain scans on them and we can show bits of their brain not functioning in the same way as other people. Now there's an interesting question there is, are they born like that? Or did they end up that way because something occurred that made that part of their brain not function properly? Interesting question. There is some evidence that actually developmental problems can cause these sorts of brain abnormalities that lead to this sort of psychopathology. And I'm going to leave that, actually, the details of that there for a moment, because I'm not particularly interested in you delving massively into that. If you're interested in it, feel free to sort of look at the stuff, and I've put some links up online to it. But the principle I want you to get is the idea that this is a very different approach. What we're saying here is there may be some individuals who are in some way more disposed to behave in an evil manner than others. And if you think that's almost completely opposite to what we've got from the Zimbardo and Milgram stuff, because what that's saying is that given the right situation, anybody would behave in these evil manners. So it's almost diametrically opposite to Zimbardo and Milgram. So now, where's me remote gone over there? I'll come back to that later on. So, does Baron Cohen's idea fit with our available evidence? Well, let's look at some of the evidence, the bit I hadn't been mentioning earlier on, of individuals that are in some way damaged and behave in an apparently evil manner. The cases I talked about last week, Mary Bell, the murder of Jamie Bulger, you'll see it's the 20th anniversary this week of that, and that story's been back in the news. Interestingly, I mentioned this a bit last week, but it just shows you how difficult a subject this is to grapple with. That actually, for the Mary Bell case, which was 1968, actually we're starting to see some decent work being done about that and people starting to understand what went on. This case, 20 years ago, but still very difficult because the emotions are still very raw, even 20 years later. And the school shootings in America. Now, in all of those cases, actually, this argument that there's something about those individuals that made them behave in that way starts to make a bit more sense because we haven't got any of the de-individualisation stuff going on here. You could argue, I suppose, that if you were saying what Zimbardo says about it's the situation somebody is in that makes them behave in a particular way, that certainly for Mary Bell, she was in a horrific situation, and that may have driven her. But if you look at particularly the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings, there's no sign of an evil situation there. And so there, and certainly in the Jamie Bulger case as well, it seems like there may be something about those particular individuals that's caused evil to happen. Now, again, are they born that way, or does something change in their brain which results in them behaving that way? Is a massively open question. I mean, I'd suggest certainly if you look at the evidence in the Mary Bell case, I think there's a pretty good argument to be had that says that her upbringing was such a mess that actually that could have had developmental impact on her brain, and that may have resulted in an absence of empathy, which led to what we ended up with. The case in America is an interesting one. It's very difficult to get sensible data on that. There's a lot of talk at the moment of there being a relationship between these school shootings and the use of psychoactive drugs in some way. And it certainly does appear that the guy in this case was on some sort of medication, but very difficult to come up with sensible conclusions about that question. Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a suggestion that the guy here was somewhere on the autistic spectrum. But again, he seems to have been relatively high functioning if he was on the autistic spectrum, because what he managed to actually achieve. No, actually stuff that's going to affect your brain chemistry. Now, hopefully you can see there that the Simon Baron-Cohen's approach of looking for something individual to a person and trying to say, did this cause them to act in an evil manner, sort of works as an explanation here. When we look at things like the Rwandan genocide I talked about last week, where half of a country decided they were going to murder the other half of a country, it's not hugely plausible to say half of the Rwandan population had some sort of psychopathology. It just doesn't make any sense. Question? Oh, that'll be something for the... I will come back to all possible conspiracy theory stuff in a few weeks' time. So, what we've got here is the idea that actually something very different. These three cases seem to fit with this individual difference approach. That actually, what we're saying here is that, yeah, there's something about the individuals here that caused this. But if you then take that individual differences approach and apply it to the Rwandan genocide, Nazi Germany, it doesn't really make any sense at all. Suggesting that, you know, the whole machinery of Nazi Germany's extermination camps all had some sort of psychopathology doesn't seem to work. You might be able to stand up that one or two people at the top had this psychopathology, but then saying that that works across the whole of the population logically doesn't seem to hang together very well. Now, I will leave, at that point, I'm going to go back to the second half of the video, then we're going to have a look at trying to grab all this stuff together a bit. Yeah. Yes, I will come back to that when we do the lecture. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Play.
MI5, Mr. Wade. And images of death, degradation, and torture.
I should say, just before I start that was the warning of images of death, degradation, of torture. This is quite hard viewing, the second half of this. Not that the first half wasn't.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. That will be diminished the moment that Saddam Hussein is disarmed.
And we believe he has, in fact, reconstituted nuclear weapons. There's no doubt in my mind that he has weapons, chemical, biological weapons, and has been working on nuclear weapons. When I first got to Iraq, we saw, you know, all the blown up tanks. You know, they were bombed from the sky. You know, bullet holes everywhere. You know, it was like going into a Mad Max movie. Like Mad Max Return to Thunderdome. Like, wow, I'm at war. Like, wow. You know, we're just like, part of you was like, this is cool. Then the other part of you was like, damn, well, we gotta do this. But somebody gotta pay.
I remember as we left Kuwait, I volunteered to be a gunner. It was a 12-hour ride, and I said, I'll gun. I'm new here. Just tell me what I'm looking for, and I'll gun all day on this whole convoy. And I said, but the only thing I need to know is the rules of engagement. And they all kind of look at me. I'm like, I need our rules of engagement. I've never been in a combat zone before. And they said, well, if it looks like the enemy, shoot it. I'm like, no, I'm serious. Now, if I need rules of engagement, what constitutes the enemy, whatever. We just told you, Sergeant. If it looks like the enemy, shoot it. And I looked at him, I said, you know, I've really never been outside the United States. Everything looks like the enemy to me out here.
Are we leaving yellow ones to signal for us?
Units in Iraq are picking up people on hunches and suspicions. For instance, you'll get an intelligence report that someone driving a black Opel, which is a model of car over there, was involved in an IED attack. So they'll just round up people with black Opels and bring them in for interrogation. Any kind of hunch that these units had, they would act on it and arrest people. They just arrested everyone.
وباب تنفتح علينا باب البيت من ضربة قوية وطلعنا نشوف شغل الأمريكان داخل البيت كلهم بنات دخلوا اطلعوا برا طلعونا كليتنا برا احنا الأطفال والنساء واحنا الرجال عزلوا النساء والأطفال على صفحة واحنا الرجال على صفحة وهاي 9 بالليل تقريبا شلون جو بارد الأطفال قاموا يبكون من الخوف الرعب مال الدخول علينا وياهم تكرم كلاب إضافة إلى الأغراض اللي كسروها والأغراض اللي انباقت من البيت ذهب وفلوس طلعونا أني وأبوي الله يرحمه وعمي وولد عمي خذونا طلعونا برا وهذا ضربوني لي ورا مع الروايات مشونا سرا بالشارع قعدونا بالشارع هاي أول بدايته يعني أول بداية
That over 30,000 people were executed over there during Saddam's regime. That they were buried right there, most of them were. And just very horrible stories of prisoner tortures. Of course, there were pictures of Saddam all over the prison. The place was horrible. There were wild dogs running around, digging up human bodies.
It was a place inside the prison, like the death chamber that we called it, where it was 2 holes in the floor and hanging hooks. You know, they said they hung people every day. They'd hang like 80, 100 people a day or something like that. Where we lived at in our barracks, there was 2 ovens in there that we, what do you call it, an incinerator for bodies. It was kind of like, okay, whoa, where are we living at? You know how many lost souls or displaced souls are walking around here?
It was very, very hot. The heat index, direct sunlight was 130, and the odor was, I'll never forget the smell of Abu Ghraib. The smell of sweat and trash and feces and urine wafting through the air. It's just, I will never forget the smell of Abu Ghraib.
Just a desert bowl of misery is the only way to describe it.
And the place was just so dark, you know, and knew the history, and like you felt like it was a haunted place. You know, like at nighttime, there's certain hallways you wouldn't want to go down by yourself because you're afraid there might be a ghost or something, and you knew if something was there, it was really pissed off. It's just the most surreal place you can imagine. It's like a combination of Apocalypse Now meets The Shining. except that, this is real and you're in the middle of it.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
We got fucking at least 3 missiles here.
We requested resources and assistance many times, almost on a daily basis, at some points practically pleading for resources, not only for Abu Ghraib, but for all of the other prison facilities we were trying to restore and reopen. Somebody had this crazy idea that they could restore all of the prison systems and get the new Iraqi guards retrained in the right way to do an appropriate prison operation in 90 days or less. There was no plan for anything.
We get there and we're told, okay, put your weapons away, put your trucks away and park them. You're not going to need them any longer. Like, what are you talking about? Well, these people that were there, said, okay, no, you're going to be prison guards. You're going to augment the guard force inside. So our commander was like, hey, what are we doing? We're not corrections. I was like, our guys never been trained to do anything like that. So hence, we put our weapons away, our tons of ammunition away, and then we became prison guards with no training whatsoever.
And we all look at each other, what? The 72nd MP company is leaving, and we're going to take their place. If there was ever a turn in morale, it was right there that I could see. Everything just hit rock bottom.
Abu Ghraib turned out to be the most attacked U.S. position in Iraq, meaning that they got shelled every day, shot at every day, every single day, all day, every day.
And there was holes in one of the walls from shrapnel that a mortar had just hit. I think it was maybe a week before we came, or a couple days before we came. And he was telling us how the guy was praying and a mortar hit and killed a bunch of prisoners. So, you definitely didn't feel safe being there.
The road outside the prison is the most dangerous road on the planet Earth. You have more fatalities on that road, more IEDs on that road, more shots fired on that road than any road in the world. You could be walking to your barracks. Boom. Oh man, incoming. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Yep.
Which way to go? Honestly don't know. Dough brings dough makes foes. Froze in my clothes, my mom won't close. The low refuge road where my mind is a basement. Do I actually have a choice on my placement? Do I really have a voice for my displacement? Am I in the front, running with my face wet? Or am I in the back, wanting to let the race win? Don't wanna face it, feel like I'm in space. Getting off beyond time is a hard way to live. All I do is take, all I do is give. I'm so fucking tired of living in this pattern. Cause everybody on earth also lives in Saturn. Am I the one that's crazy? People's minds seem lazy. Great God made me, I'm thinking they can't face it.
That's right. Abu Ghetto. Ghetto Abu.
Oh, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm
In July and August, the prison population was fairly stable, and I would say at the highest numbers it was still less than 1,000. By the end of September, it went to over 6,000. We had just short of 300 military police personnel at Abu Ghraib to guard thousands of prisoners.
You had the general population prisoners, which were basically a huge massacre thrown into a mud pit surrounded by concertina wire. And then you had the hard sites, which is where the intel holds were at, as well as the insane or the criminal. And then there was an even more, the most secure section was where they had the women and the children.
The females that we had were, the spouses or sisters or cousin of high value detainees that were being used as, like, okay, well, we have your sister, we have your wife, you need to turn yourself in. Same thing with the little children. And we had like 9-year-olds in there. I'm like, why do I have a 9-year-old in a prison? It's crazy. But yeah, that's what was there.
I was chosen to work at the hard site because I'm a female, and they needed females working 1B. And that's mainly where they stuck me when Megan Ambule wasn't working.
In the hard site, there was probably 6 or 7 guards guarding, I would say, at least 1,000 detainees, if not more. And you had all those, if all those prisoners got to coordinating that at one time, the guards that were inside of the compound would have been dead. It was such a scary situation to live under.
The prisoners in the hard site were like the lowest scum on the earth, the Al-Qaeda's, the Taliban, Saddam Hussein, Fadain, Wahhabis, just all terrorist bad guys. And they were American killers.
We were told that these detainees were the worst of the worst, and the information to get was going to save lives. It was going to have, somebody said at one point, it was going to have global implications.
I think the military intelligence personnel were caught pretty much by surprise at this number of prisoners being brought in that had to undergo an interview at least, or interrogations. Their assessment within the first couple of weeks was, ma'am, most of them are just guilty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They don't have any information. Well, according to them at that time, it was about 75 to 80% of the people being brought in really didn't have any information of value or any information at all about terrorism.
The interrogators that I worked with at Abu Ghraib were all extremely frustrated by the lack of intelligence that they were getting during interrogations. And most of them attributed that to the fact that they had prisoners who didn't have intelligence to give them. The interrogators who were in my unit spent all year there, and they were telling me that they got nothing.
أنا ما أعرف ليش مسجون. جابوني بقوني 7 أشهر أنا وأولادي وما أعرف ليش مسجون. شنو التهمة مالتي؟ قالوا لي أنت تسوي متفجرات وتسوي عبوات ناسفة وخلاص ما أعرف. وشنو الدليل اللي والمستمسك اللي عليه؟ ماكو. مجرد وشاية أحد المواطنين قال لهم هالشكل.
Of Abu Ghraib contains strong language and nudity, with descriptions and images of death, degradation and torture.
In the summer of 2003, the insurgency grew at a very rapid rate. You had the bombing of the UN headquarters in August, the bombing of the Jordanian embassy, the bombing of the Turkish embassy, and then at the end of October, the attack on the Rashid Hotel, where most American workers in the Green Zone were housed.
Thanks to the United States of America, 50 million people once lived under tyranny, and today they live in freedom.
The American military had no idea who these people were. How do we fight an enemy we cannot see? The only way to do that is to interrogate enough people that we will get usable intelligence that will allow us to nip the insurgency in the bud. And I think there was a degree of panic about the lack of intelligence and the lack of knowledge about the insurgency.
Rumsfeld was openly irritated about it. And then we come to accounts in the summer of 2003 of an intelligence briefing that occurred at the Pentagon involving Rumsfeld, Cambone, a handful of other senior officers. And he's described as being openly angry, pounding his fist on the table, and asking in a taunting way, why is it that Guantanamo gets me good intel, just what I want, and I don't get this out of Iraq? I've had it with this. I want you to get Miller out to Iraq and Gitmoize the situation and do it fast.
Miller, by all accounts, is a man who is, in a way, Rumsfeld's kind of officer, which is to say he doesn't care about past practice, he doesn't care about tradition necessarily. What he cares about is getting results. And he established a system in Guantanamo that was based on getting information from these detainees, which is to say, using harsher interrogation techniques.
The combatants here at JTF Guantanamo in a humane manner. Everything that we do inside Camp Delta, America can be proud of.
I am telling you what I believe in every inch of my body to be the truth. And I have spent a lot of time on secure video with the people down there. I have talked to people who've been down there and come back, and I haven't found a single scrap of any kind of information that suggests that anyone has been treated anything other than humanely, notwithstanding everything we have read and heard.
At the time, there were rumors coming out of Guantanamo that prisoners were being abused. Certainly, certain of the human rights organizations had detected those kinds of rumors and written letters to the administration urging the administration not to engage in this kind of practice. So I think word was starting to leak out as to something occurring in Guantanamo.
General Miller at Guantanamo turned Guantanamo from a conventional U.S. military prison that would abide by the laws of war into a kind of ad hoc behavioral laboratory for the introduction, the use of extreme techniques.
A lot of what we know about what went on in the cells during interrogations at Guantanamo, we know from FBI officers who went down.
I'm going to leave that at that point for two reasons. One is that we all know where it ends up, and two, actually what I will do is I'll put up, that's the whole thing is available on YouTube, so I'll put the link up and you can watch the end of it if you want to. A couple of observations to make about that before I go on. Firstly, as I said earlier on, you need to be very, very careful with this material, that you don't go, you don't actually do exactly what some of the people in that film have done and act on prejudice alone. Coming up with the idea that, having seen this, all Americans are obviously mad killers makes absolutely no sense. As I said, that particular film was produced by exactly the same production company that make The Wire, The Sopranos, HBO. Equally, not unsimilar things to that are going on as we speak in Syria. Unfortunately, we don't know about it. In Syria, it's sadly Muslim people killing Muslim people. Here it was Muslim people and Muslim people and Americans. So actually, saying one side good, one side bad is a completely stupid argument. Makes no sense, doesn't help us at all. Having said all that, what can we get out of that? I think already you're seeing that, you see those pictures originally, you're thinking those guards are evil. What was, when those pictures were first published, the American government's response was, this was a few bad apples who behaved in an evil manner. You now see that film, and I think you'll agree that you start to think, well, actually, if we're making a list of who the evil people were here, it probably wasn't the soldiers working in that prison. The one I was taken with was the guy, and it still strikes me every time I watch that film, the guy who was saying that they were flying to the base and it was a 12-hour flight and he was acting as the gunner. And he asked for the rules of engagement and they told him just to shoot anything that was the enemy. And he didn't, because he said he'd never been outside of America. Everything looked like the enemy. It's, for a moment, put yourself in that situation. It's a horrific thought. So, very, very complex ideas going on here. But clearly, if there's one sensible conclusion we can draw from that, it's not one side good, one side bad, because that is just daft. So, having said all that, where does that get us with questions? Where does this leave the idea of evil, all of this? Well, first question, and where I started off way back last Thursday at 1 o'clock, is evil a useful term? Does it actually get us very far? Well, I think you can analyse that at more than one level. Firstly, socially, does calling something evil provide us with any help in some way? Well, we've already talked about it, that from a sort of pre-science religious perspective, yeah, there is an explanation of why you would want to label something as evil, because as we said about, you know, way back in the Middle Ages, the idea of if the world is run by an all-seeing, all-good God, how can evil things happen? Okay, we need the evil set up there, we need Satan, and strangely enough, if you look at Christianity, Islam and Judaism was the word I was looking for there, you see the same story of the fall of Satan from heaven. So, socially it seems to serve some sort of purpose, and if you look at back where I started off about the shootings at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, that very day the governor of the state turns up and says evil has visited this town today. And there does seem to be something about us naturally wanting an explanation for things we don't understand. And if there's something we don't understand, we want to pin some explanation on it, because not understanding it is worse. If we can say this caused it, that gives us some sort of comfort. So labelling it as evil socially does seem to serve some purpose. And certainly there's in evolutionary psychology, you'll find an idea which says that actually if you find a particular concept across loads of different cultures, it probably serves some useful purpose. And certainly cultures all over the world have the concept of evil, so it does seem to serve some purpose to us. That said, the difficulty is that Middle Ages idea of evil still persists in some cultures today, and does lead to all sorts of horror stories. And thank you for the person who emailed me and reminded me of this story, but this goes back a few years, this story, but some years ago, I was about to say the body, but the torso of a small African child was found in the Thames, missing arms, legs and head. Eventually this story went on for a number of years, and it was tracked down to a ritual exorcism that had taken place, because he was thought he was evil in some way, he'd been possessed by demons. So this social idea of evil still does exist in London. This was in London. So socially it's there, and it does seem to serve some purpose, but it can have some hugely negative effects. But if I go back one, that's socially, but actually we're meant to be psychologists. We're looking for explanations. So does it get us, where do we get to with looking for explanations? Well, I think what I'd suggest to you is that actually what we are what we're about, what psychology, if you look at the front page of the BPS website, it says psychology is the science of human behaviour. We're looking for explanations for human behaviour. And what have we got? Well, if we look at the Zimbardo and Milgram stuff, which, actually, before I go on there, the thought I've just had at the end of that film, to cap all that stuff off, that film, the US military in all its unfortunate happenings there, who paid for the Stanford Prison Experiment? The US Navy. The same people paid for it. The very day those photographs from Abu Ghraib came out, loads of first-year undergraduates came up to me and said, how did they not see that coming? And hopefully you can see the sense of that now, having seen that. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Where does psychology fit with trying to explain this behaviour? Well, if we start off with things like the Rwandan genocide I talked about last week, you start to see there some sense of the sort of the depersonalisation and de-individualisation stuff, and some of that rings true with the work of Milgram and Zimbardo. Certainly if you look at Nazi Germany, a lot of that starts to ring true. That actually obeying figures of authority, depersonalising the people that you were persecuting, all fits together. So that looks like it works. That looks like it's an explanation of evil, the Milgram and Zimbardo stuff. But if we apply the Milgram and Zimbardo stuff to the killers of Jamie Bulger, to Mary Bell, to the shootings at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, makes absolutely no sense at all. Where's the de-individualisation and depersonalisation going on there? Where's the figure of authority telling them to do it? That's not there either. So we've got a theory there which very nicely explains one bit of evidence, but completely contradicted by another bit of evidence. So if we go to the other extreme and look at Simon Baron-Cohen's ideas around lack of empathy, and this explaining acts of evil, and if you can't see emotions in others and can't respond with the appropriate emotion, does that cause you to behave in an evil manner? Well, again, if we look at the evidence we've got, in the case of the killers of Jamie Bulger, in the case of Mary Bell, the Sandy Hook Elementary School, actually that might fit. We've got individuals there who look like they may have had some sort of mental health issues which may have led them to behave in that particular way. So that fits. But then if you take that evidence of these individual differences and say, does that fit with the Rwandan genocide? Well, are we saying that half the population of Rwanda have got this particular absence in their brain that causes this issue? That just doesn't fit. So you end up with a situation where some of the theories fit some of it, some of the theories fit other bits of it, which sadly is welcome to the world of psychology. Actually, one of the things, I was talking to one of my colleagues this morning about what I wanted you to get out of this lecture, and it's this. Anybody offers you a nice, shiny, single explanation for some human behaviour, step back a bit and go, yeah, right, okay. I'll have a think about that myself if you don't mind. Because actually, hopefully you can see from this that what we've got here is a whole range of very, very complex human behaviour. We've got from, at the one extreme, Germany between 1933 odd and 1945, where there was a whole mechanism of mass murder set up. To the extent of that film we watched last week, the thought of somebody designed a crematorium that was powered by human body fat. think about that for a moment. That still in existence are the contracts for all the people who designed those crematoria. This wasn't one or two people, this was a mass operation. It was industrialised. Now, at that end of it, we've got that sort of behaviour. How could possibly that be also linked to two 10-year-old boys in a Liverpool shopping centre who take a 2-year-old boy from that shopping centre and kill him? How could that be the same thing? It just doesn't seem to ring true. So does calling those two things evil really make much sense? Can they be the same thing? Socially, it might make us feel better because we can get gives us some sort of explanation. But when it comes to explaining the psychology of it, it seems very difficult to say those two things are connected in any way. They seem to be two very different sorts of human behaviour. Now, undoubtedly, within Nazi Germany, there were individuals who were on that 0 degrees of empathy scale and quite enjoyed what they were doing. There's not much doubt about that. You know, the odd 0.5% of people who might be like that. But in practice, very unlikely. And you can see that if you look at those videos, and there's a few brief clips in that film of the Milgram's participants. Did those participants look like they were blindingly obeying authority? No, they looked uncomfortable, didn't they? They weren't blindly obeying an authority figure, they were still uncomfortable. Eventually they were carrying on with it, but it weren't that they were just blindly doing it. So it's very different there. They obviously did have some empathy with the individual they were shocking. So it's actually a much more complex idea, and it would seem, certainly I think if you look at the evidence I've presented to you, that what you've got there is lots of different sorts of behaviour, and trying to label them all as evil doesn't really get us anywhere in terms of an explanation. But if nothing else, and if you don't do this question in the exam and after doing the multiple choice questions, you never think about it again, the thing I would like you to take away from these two sessions is that if somebody presents you with, here is a single explanation for some sort of human behaviour, just take a step back and go, yeah. This conversation usually involves somebody going, we've discovered the gene for, and then adding a word on the end of that, which is usually one of the world's most nonsense phrases. But actually just think about there are multiple explanations for human behaviour. Very rarely do we come across one single explanation. At that point, I'm going to talk a little bit about essay writing, and then just a few final thoughts. And I will do what I did last week. Rather than having another break, I'll just stop early. So, essay writing. So, you're going to get 7 topics. The exam will have 7 questions, 1 for each topic. You'll have an hour to answer that question. You won't have seen the question in advance. However, if you attend the revision session at the end, you might get some guidance. So, things to do. If you're interested in a particular topic, do the reading that we've presented you with. Please, please, please don't just repeat exactly what we've said in the lecture, in the order we said it in the lecture. Question? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You do whichever question you want. You're going to. The exam paper will have 7 questions on it. You do 1 of them. Don't just repeat the lecture slides. The most depressing thing for us marking exam scripts is reading an essay which is exactly in the same order as what we said. We want you to take the question we've given you, use the information that you've studied to answer the question that we've given you. I've presented this in a particular order, but and if you can go away and find other stuff, use other examples, bring in other bits of research, that's what we want you to do. Just repeating what we've said is really, it might get you through this year, but it's certainly not going to get you through next year or the year after. It's you going away to look for the material. On that same subject, please, when you're doing this, don't try and write an essay before you get to the exam, because you don't know what the question is. You need to have the material that you can then synthesize into the right answer, the right order when you get to the exam. If you just deliver an essay you've already written, the chances are you're not going to have addressed the question we actually asked you. And that's, again, very depressing for us marking it, because we sit there going, well, this person clearly knows stuff. It's just sadly not what we'd asked them to tell us. So, in terms of this one, I've put plenty of reading material up on UEL+. Now, this particular topic is different from some of the other ones that you will cover, because some of the things that you will cover will be very bits of, sorry, question before I rephrase that sentence. No, I should say that there will not be previous exam questions, because we vary these subjects every year, so there aren't previous exam questions. What was that weird sentence I started? Very... Yeah, I've completely lost the thread of that one. What was I talking about? Yes, no, yeah, right. Different questions are going to require different approaches from you. Some of the topics that you cover are going to be, if you like, bits of traditional psychology research, where it is going to be going away and looking at journal articles and writing about journal articles. And this journal article said this journal article said this journal article said that. Other things, like what I've covered here, this is going to be much more you putting together a coherent argument based on the evidence that you've got. And so it's going to be testing different sorts of skills depending on which question you choose to do. And it will be very obvious from you'll have seen here that I've not given you chapter and verse of, now quote this reference, now quote that reference. Other lectures will. So it's going to be a different pattern of essay you might write depending on whichever question you choose to address. Question? No, there are 7 topics, that's it. How about that? Yeah, very briefly, because I won't labour this too much, because I'm going to come back and talk about exam questions in this. We will expect you, this is the same for any essay exam, we will expect you to know the key references for that area that you're talking about. For instance, if you are writing an essay on this subject and you are talking about the Stanford prison experiment, I would expect to see in brackets somewhere in that essay, Zimbardo 1974. Now, you don't have to produce at the end of it a reference section saying where was that published and what the title was. But I would expect you to know, if we're talking about this, I'd expect to see Zimbardo, Milgram, Baron Cohen coming up. Not necessarily all. If you were talking about testing some of this stuff experimentally, that Bandura testing it, I'd expect to see that there. I've got no particular objection to, in an exam, if you have a complete blank as to exactly what year it was, but you write, in the mid-1970s, Bandura did X, Y, and Z, that's perfectly all right. We're not going to object to that. If you write, in 2010, Bandura did, I might go, no, you're a bit off there. But, so... And equally, the same with the Zimbardo stuff. If you say in the early 70s Zimbardo did X, Y, and Z, because you've had a complete mental block. But if you say last year Zimbardo did, not quite the same. So, but no reference section. But you will need to know the key studies. So when Joy does eyewitness stuff, if there's not an Elizabeth Loftus reference in there somewhere, something's going to have gone wrong. I suspect tomorrow with the stuff that Anna's doing, there'll be Chris French references left, right and centre. So it's the key references for whatever subject it is that you're addressing. I think, actually two more things to say before I sum up. Number one, please remember that, well, two things. Number one, there are a lot of contentious subjects we're going to cover in these modules, very deliberately, because it makes it more interesting to teach. However, please remember that hopefully the lectures themselves may well change your views on that subject. For instance, I suspect last Thursday afternoon when I showed you those videos, the pictures from Abu Ghraib, you probably thought, yeah, those soldiers are evil for doing that. Now you're probably thinking, well, I'm not quite so sure about that, although the blokes in suits, I don't like the look of them. So that will change that. So be aware of the fact that that will happen. Now, just before I sum up, let's just have a quick look. Does evil stem from nature or nurture? Well, I think we've probably established already that both is the answer to that question. When we look at theories and differences in men and women, does that apply to homosexuals? That's a really good question. There are actually, one of my ex-colleagues who's not here now has done studies demonstrating physiological differences between homosexual and heterosexual males. So some of that work is being done. Oh, no, that's somebody who's giving me a conspiracy theory. That will be future weeks. What's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? That sounds like it's something for you to Google rather than ask me. What is it we need to prove we participated in a study? Either the participation sheet, print out whatever you've got online, as long as I've got some record. What's your view on the Christopher Dorner case? I don't know that one. I'll have to look that up. Yeah. The thing about actually, that's a good. Actually, shut up a minute while I finish this, and then I will be finished. The thing about the lack of empathy, psychopaths, and businessmen being narcissists. There's a brilliant book by a guy called John Ronson called The Psychopath Test, which covers this stuff and really interesting. I'll put a link up to the video that I've shown you in Lucifer example. Yes, Zimbardo's conclusion about Abu Ghraib is that it's the system that's evil, not the individuals in it, and that it's the situation that they were put in that causes the problem. And I should say, the video I put up, there's a sort of 15-minute video up on Moodle of Zimbardo talking about this, which is really interesting. Actually, the book as well, which is you'll get in the library. I put a chapter of it up on Moodle. Is also a really interesting read, and it's really the first time that book's the first time that Zimbardo was talked about to any extent the effect the study had on him as well. You said. Aha! Thank you. Yeah, an interesting one for one of my lectures next year. The question about what's going on in Syria. Are Muslims killing Muslims, or are one side good Muslims and one side bad Muslims? Or indeed not Muslims at all. All I'd ask whoever sent me that text, and if you're thinking that point, think about Northern Ireland 20 years ago. Was Northern Ireland populated by good Christians and people who weren't Christian killing each other? Or were they both two different versions of Christians killing each other? Or did one side think they were Christian and the other side were the baddies, and the other side thought they were Christian and the other side were baddies? These are complex questions. I don't think you can, saying that the one side is good and the other side is bad, I don't think gets you very far in a lot of these things. How many modules do we get to pick next year? Well, that's an obscure question, but you do 4 core modules, 2 option modules, so you do 1 option in each semester. So, my final point before I leave. This book was written in 1954. Covers an awful lot of what we've been talking about. So it's a novel, I should say. Covers an awful lot of what we've been talking about today. At least 10 years before psychologists ever bothered to think about it. You might want to consider that in a lot of areas, that actually psychology gets a lot of these things late. Actually, other people have thought about them a lot. And actually, that's a perfect example of, if you read Lord of the Flies, it sounds like the Stanford Prison Experiment. At that point, I shall shut up. I will hang about and answer questions. Oh, one very final point. It's very brief. This module is not just me taking the lectures. Next week, tomorrow, next week, it will be different people. Please, please treat whoever comes to do the lecture with hopefully the same level of respect that I would get. At that point, I will shut up. Thank you.